Laugh was what did it, not the text, not the way she touched his arm. The laugh. My wife has a specific laugh. She saves for certain moments, high, unguarded, the kind that closes her eyes. I hadn't heard that laugh in maybe 3 years. And there it was, across a banquet hall full of 200 people, aimed at a man who was not me. I set down my glass of sparkling water and stood very still. We were at the retirement dinner for my old colleague Doug Hartwell, 40 years in commercial real estate, the kind of man who still wears a tie to his own birthday. My wife, I'll call her my wife, because she was still my wife that night, had told me she was running late, said she'd meet me there. Work thing, she said. A client call that ran over. I'd arrived alone, shaken some hands, found my seat at table 7. She was already there. Not late at all. She was at the far end of the room near the bar, standing close to a man named Brett. Someone she'd introduced to me once, maybe 8 months before, as a colleague from her firm's new partnership division. Young, 40, maybe 41. The kind of man who keeps himself very put together in a way that takes real effort but looks effortless. She was laughing that laugh. I picked up my phone and took a photo, not to confront her. I don't know exactly why. Some instinct. The kind that acts before your mind catches up. Then I walked to my table, sat down, and spent the next 3 hours smiling at people I knew. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 18 months before that night. My wife and I had been married for 22 years. We'd built something real together. We met when I was 34, working in logistics management for a mid-sized shipping company in Columbus, Ohio. She was 31, recently hired at an accounting firm downtown. We married after 2 years, had one son together. He was 19 and finishing his sophomore year at Ohio State when all of this happened. The marriage wasn't perfect. I won't pretend otherwise. After our son left for college, the house got quiet in a way that took some adjustment. We argued more about small things, the way couples do when the common project of raising a child is suddenly finished. But I didn't think we were in trouble. I thought we were in that normal middle stretch that every long marriage has, the part where you have to consciously choose each other again. And we just hadn't gotten around to doing that choosing yet. Looking back, I can see exactly when things started shifting. It was around the time she got promoted to senior partner at her firm and began working with the new strategic partnerships team. More travel, more late evenings, different energy when she came home. Not tired, exactly. Lit up, but not by anything to do with me. I told myself it was just the excitement of a new role. I am very good at telling myself things. The first real sign I chose to ignore came about a year before the retirement dinner. I was going through our shared checking account. We'd kept a joint account for household expenses since the beginning, and I noticed a recurring charge I didn't recognize. A hotel in Chicago, the same Marriott, 3 separate weekends over a 4-month period. Each charge was around $400. I asked her about it. She said the firm had been doing quarterly off-site workshops and that sometimes she extended her stays an extra night to prepare for Sunday morning sessions. She said it in the matter-of-fact way she says everything, and I said, okay. I said, okay. I did not check further. That is the part I have to live with. After the retirement dinner, I didn't say anything to her. We drove home separately. She brought her own car. And when we got home, I told her I was tired and went to bed early. She didn't seem concerned. That bothered me more than almost anything else. If she had sensed something was wrong, if she had been watching me across that room the way I'd been watching her, she would have been at least a little careful. She wasn't careful at all. I lay in the dark for a long time thinking about the laugh. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention in a way I should have been paying attention for a long time. Her phone never left her hand, which was new. Not new like something she'd just started, new like something I was just now noticing. She took calls in the garage. When I walked into the kitchen while she was texting, the screen tilted away from me in a movement so practiced it looked natural. I didn't snoop through her phone. I want to be clear about that. What I did instead was go back through our financial records. We had 2 accounts, the joint household checking account and a joint savings account we've been building for 20 years for retirement. We also each had individual accounts from before the marriage that we'd never merged. That was always our arrangement. Mine had my freelance income from some consulting work I picked up over the years. Hers had whatever she chose to keep separate. What I found in the joint savings account took me about 4 minutes to locate and about 4 days to fully absorb. Over 26 months, my wife had made a series of transfers, not large enough to trigger any automatic alert. $2,000 here, $3,500 there, a few transfers of $5,000, all labeled in the memo line as things like home maintenance, insurance prepayment, professional development. In total, $68,000. Gone from the account we'd spent 2 decades building together for our retirement. I sat at the kitchen table with the bank statements spread in front of me, and I didn't feel angry right away. I felt something more like vertigo. The kind that happens when the floor beneath a room you thought you knew turns out to be a false bottom. I called a friend of mine, a man I'd known since college, someone who works as a CPA and has helped me with taxes for 15 years. I told him what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked if I'd spoken to an attorney. I hadn't. He gave me a name. I called that week. The attorney was a woman who specialized in family law. She had an office in a brick building near downtown Columbus, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she did not react to anything I told her with surprise. That steadiness helped me. She told me several things I needed to hear. The first was to stop moving money or changing any accounts because that could complicate proceedings later. The second was to document everything I found before doing anything else. The third was that marital funds transferred out of a joint account without consent were legally relevant, and that the paper trail I already had was more useful than I realized. I spent the next 6 weeks documenting. I wasn't looking for drama. I wasn't building a case for confrontation. I was building something solid in a situation where everything familiar had turned unstable, and that process gave me somewhere to put my hands. What I found in those 6 weeks went beyond the transfers. Through some careful work, which I will not detail here because it involved the kind of patience that only becomes possible when you stop sleeping properly, I was able to piece together where portions of the money had gone. Brett's firm had launched a real estate investment vehicle about 2 years prior, the kind of private offering that isn't publicly listed and requires knowing someone on the inside to access. My wife knew someone on the inside to access. My wife knew someone on the inside. $68,000 of our retirement savings had been invested in his firm's fund. I want to be careful here. Investing jointly earned money in an undisclosed private fund without your spouse's knowledge or consent is not just a marriage problem. My attorney was very clear on that point. It was also the kind of arrangement that raises specific questions that would eventually be directed not just at my wife, but at Brett's firm, and by extension, at Brett himself. I didn't make those calls. My attorney did. I also found the hotel records, not by breaking into anything, by going back to our credit card statements, the joint card we used for travel, and cross-referencing dates she told me she was at professional conferences. Over 19 months, there were 11 hotel stays I couldn't account for, 9 of them in cities where Brett's firm had satellite offices or projects. The dates overlapped with weekends she'd said she was catching up on client work. 11 weekends. I sat with that number for a long time, 22 years, and 11 weekends that belonged to someone else. I told my son before I told her. I don't know if that was the right order. I go back and forth on it. He was home for a long weekend in early spring, and I sat him down on a Saturday morning with coffee at the kitchen table, and I told him what I'd found. Not the emotional version, the factual version. The accounts, the dates, the transfers. I gave him the shape of it without all the jagged edges. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known?" I said, "Long enough to be sure." He didn't take her side or my side that day. He just sat with it. I appreciated that more than I expected to. He was 19 and he handled it with more steadiness than I'd given him credit for. He left early that Sunday. Before he left, he hugged me in the way that men hug when they don't have the right words. Tight, brief, meaning everything. I confronted her on a Tuesday evening. She came home at 7:15, which was later than she'd said, which no longer surprised me. I was sitting in the living room with the lights on. The documents were on the coffee table, not dramatically fanned out, just stacked. A pile. She noticed it immediately. She set her keys down slowly. "What is this?" she said. "Sit down," I said. She didn't sit. I told her what I'd found. I told her about the transfers, the hotel stays, the investment in his fund. I told her I'd already spoken to an attorney. I was calm. I want to be clear about that. I was completely calm, and I think that frightened her more than if I'd been angry. Anger is manageable. Calm is not. She started with denial, which I'd expected. Then she moved to minimizing. It wasn't what it looked like. The investment had been her idea to diversify. She'd been meaning to tell me. Then she stopped and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you known?" The same question my son had asked. "Long enough," I said again. She started to cry. She told me she hadn't meant for it to become what it became. She said he'd pursued her. She said she knew that wasn't an excuse. She said the money, and here she stumbled. She said she thought the investment would grow, and she'd been planning to put it back before I ever noticed. "Put it back," I said. "Yes, $68,000. She didn't say anything. I told her I wanted her to leave for the night. I told her I'd be in contact through my attorney. I told her I was going to be civil about this because we had a son and because I wasn't going to let her choices define how I behaved. She picked up her keys. At the door, she turned back and started to say something. "Don't," I said. She left. The divorce took about 7 months. It was not clean, but it also wasn't catastrophic. We both had attorneys. We were both adults. The retirement account issue complicated things. That required its own separate negotiation, and ultimately a settlement that I was not entirely satisfied with, but that my attorney told me was fair, given what we could prove and what litigation would cost. Brett's involvement with the investment fund became a matter for a separate inquiry that I was not part of. My attorney filed the relevant documentation, and the rest was someone else's problem. I have heard from a mutual acquaintance that the inquiry created some complications for his firm. I do not know the specifics, and I did not seek them out. That is not my department anymore. His wife, I later learned, had known something was off for over a year. She filed for divorce around the same time I did. I never spoke to her. I considered reaching out. I had this vague instinct that she and I were parallel figures in a situation neither of us chose, but I decided against it. Some things you let settle on their own. My son came home for spring break that year, and we spent 4 days together. We drove out to Hocking Hills, walked some trails, ate bad food from a gas station because that was always our tradition. He didn't bring her up. Neither did I. We talked about his classes, his roommate situation, whether the Cleveland Browns had any realistic path forward, which is the kind of question that doesn't have an answer, but is very useful to discuss. On the last night after dinner, he said, "Dad, are you actually okay?" I told him I was getting there. He nodded. That seemed to be enough for both of us. He called me the following week, which he hadn't done with any regularity before. He's called most weeks since. I don't think that's because he felt sorry for me. I think it's because something between us loosened. Some formality that had built up while we were both living in the same orbit as a family that was performing okayness, and once it loosened, we found it easier to just be honest. I count that as the one clear good thing that came out of all of it. About 4 months after the divorce was finalized, I did something I'd been thinking about for years. I signed up for a 10-day rail trip through the Canadian Rockies. Something I'd seen in a magazine 20 years before and put in the back of my mind in the way you do when you're building a life with someone else and your own quiet wants get filed away for later. Later was now. I flew into Vancouver on a Thursday, boarded the train on Friday morning, sat down in the observation car with a cup of coffee and watched the mountains come up around the tracks, and I didn't think about account balances or attorneys or the particular sound of a woman laughing at a man who wasn't me. I just watched the mountains. On the second morning, in the dining car at breakfast, I ended up sharing a table with a retired school teacher from Portland, Oregon. She was 71, had done this trip twice before, and had the particular quality of people who are deeply at peace with themselves. Not cheerful exactly, but settled. We talked for 2 hours about, of all things, landscape photography, which she'd taken up in her 60s. I told her I'd recently gone through something difficult. She said, everyone on long train rides has either just gone through something difficult or they're about to. I thought about that for a while. On the last evening, as the train came into Jasper in low golden light, she handed me a card with a name of a photography group she was part of, based in Portland. If you ever find yourself out that way, she said, I haven't made it to Portland yet, but the card is on my desk. And a few weeks after I got back, I received an email from a woman I'd known briefly in my 30s, someone I'd lost touch with after she moved to another city, the kind of person you always think about more than you admit. She'd heard through a mutual friend that I was divorced. She was widowed. She wrote just a few lines. Nothing dramatic. I reread those lines maybe more times than I should admit. I wrote back, we've had 4 dinners since then. Nothing declared yet. Nothing rushed. But I'll tell you this, when she laughs like she means it. And for the first time in longer than I can clearly remember, I've stopped telling myself things. I've had a lot of time to think about cause and effect, not in any grand philosophical way, just the ordinary kind of thinking a man does when he's sitting alone in a house that used to have more noise in it, working backwards through decisions to figure out where things actually started. Here's what I've concluded. Most betrayals don't begin with one dramatic choice. They begin with 100 small ones. A little dishonesty tolerated here. A question not asked there. A feeling filed away because asking about it would have made things uncomfortable. My wife didn't build a secret life overnight. She built it incrementally, one weekend at a time, one transfer at a time. And I let the early signs slide because I was better at maintaining peace than I was at facing hard things. That's on me as much as it's on her. I don't say that to excuse what she did. Moving $68,000 out of a retirement account we'd spent 20 years building is not something I minimize. But I think there's a specific kind of damage that comes from a man who stops paying real attention to his own life, who assumes that because things look stable on the surface, they must be stable underneath. I was that man for longer than I'd like to admit. What I actually learned, not just intellectually, but in the way that changes behavior, is that clarity is an act of courage. Asking the question you're afraid of. Looking at the bank statement you've been half avoiding. Sitting across a banquet room and taking an honest inventory of what your eyes are telling you instead of what you want to believe. Brett made choices that had consequences, not just for me, but for his own family, his firm, his professional standing. My wife made choices that cost her the life she'd built and the trust of her son, who was not a small thing to lose. I don't feel satisfaction about any of that, but I do think actions compound the way interest compounds. Quietly, consistently, in whatever direction you've been pointed. And I think the opposite is also true. The 6 weeks I spent documenting, staying calm, talking to an attorney instead of throwing papers across a room. Those weeks built something, not just a legal case, a version of myself I could respect. My son saw that. He hasn't said so directly, but I know it in the way he calls now, regularly, like he trusts who's going to pick up. I went to Canada alone and watched mountains come up around a train, and I'd breathed for the first time in what felt like years. That trip cost me less than 2 therapy sessions and did more good than 10. There's something about moving through physical space, real distance, real landscape, that the mind uses to reorganize itself. And there's a woman I've had 4 dinners with now. No declarations, no rush. Just honest conversation between 2 people who've both been through something and come out the other side with enough self-knowledge to take it slow. That's worth more to me at 54 than almost anything I can think of. I don't know what the right lesson is to hand you from all of this. I'm suspicious of clean lessons, but if there's something I'd say plainly, it's this. Pay attention to your own life. Not anxiously, not with suspicion, but genuinely. The laugh I noticed across a crowded room. The hotel charge I asked about once and then let go. The account I should have looked at 18 months sooner. None of those were hidden from me. I just wasn't looking. Look. Stay calm when you find what you find. Build something solid to stand on before you act. And when it's over, really over, Get on a train somewhere and let the distance do its work. That's all I've got.